We hear a lot of stuff, a lot of conspiracy theories about masks, the politicisation of masks, 1.5 metres or the 2 metre distancing. I want to talk to someone who's a scientist. I'm sick of hearing politicians talk about it. I'm sick of hearing commentators who've got no fucking idea talking about it. This guy's the real deal. On this week's Straight Talk, I have brought in somebody who I know, who is an expert in pandemics and is an expert in biosecurity. His name is Dr David Heslop. Now, he's an associate professor at the University of New South Wales. Not only that, he advises the Australian Army on biosecurity, things like chemical warfare and biological warfare. And he has been doing some work all through this COVID period with the various governments. We talk about the spreadability, the reproduction rate of the COVID virus. We talk about, did we go too hard and what's the effect on our economy? In other words, did we lock down Australia too fast relative to what everybody else in the world's doing? And I'm going to ask the questions, and I'm not going to let him skirt around anything, and he's going to give us straight talk about COVID-19 and how you control it and how real a problem it really was and maybe will be in the future. G'day and welcome to another episode of Straight Talk. Now, this is a really interesting and important topic for me today, and it's called biosecurity. And biosecurity is something that's affecting this whole nation at the moment, and we are talking about COVID-19 and all our responses and all the fallout and all the economic outcomes, as well as all the medical fallouts. And with me today, I'm very pleased to say, is Dr David Heslop. Now, David's a medical doctor. He's a clinician. He's an associate professor at the University of New South Wales. Amongst many other things, many other roles, he is a consultant / advisor to the Australian Army in matters of biosecurity. Biosecurity, we're going to dig into that, see what biosecurity means in a moment. But it's a complex thing, and it's a pretty cool thing too. And fortunately for David, or unfortunately for all of us, but fortunately for David, his expertise has become extraordinarily important in this country from the beginning of this year, whereby his advice, his understanding and his knowledge probably has never been more vital to Australians generally. So welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, look, let's establish the position. And you're a medical doctor, like a GP, as in GP. Yes.
GP, yes.
You're a clinician, which means what?
Yeah. So although I work for the university in pandemic response, preparedness, research.
So just to stop there, so
Yep.
You're an associate professor at the University of New South Wales, specialising in pandemic response and research.
Correct.
Which is like exactly where we are.
Correct.
Right, okay, yep.
Yep. I do still remain clinically active. So I've got 2 fellowships. I'm a general practitioner, but I'm also an occupational physician, which is a doctor that's specialised in examining risks to people trying to do work in risky environments. So that
For example,
could be an industry, but for me, my interest is in high-risk biosecurity environments.
For example, like Afghanistan, or maybe working in Russia or like Ukraine. Is that what we're talking about? Where there might be anthrax or something? I don't know. What are we talking about?
Yeah, so that's been my specialist sort of niche that I've been focused on for my career. Broadly speaking, I also look at, is it safe to go to any location? So, for example, is it safe to go to a tropical environment for 50 people in the Defence Force, for example, where there's malaria or other endemic diseases? But my specialisation is in very risky things like biological weapons or chemical weapons, and how that might impact on wanting to do particular jobs in particular locations. Yeah.
And on top of your medical degree and all the other stuff you got, you have a PhD?
I do. So my background with my PhD preceded my medical career. So that really opened the door to academia and the journey towards research, which I've always wanted to do. And that PhD, interestingly, is quite relevant to the work that I do in modelling and simulation, which was neuroscience-based and focused on looking at responses to individuals who become traumatised in risky situations. So the response to injury, the response to blood loss. So that was a focus that actually has helped quite significantly in my current research, interestingly.
Wow. I'm going to guess from my point of view, everybody wants to know this sort of stuff too. I mean, we all get enthralled by this type of stuff. I mean, we hear about Russians allegedly poisoning, out of favour Russians who live in London, and stuff happening in, like chemical warfare allegedly in places like Syria, etc. Are these real issues? I don't mean that. I mean that modestly. Are they real issues globally?
It's a good question. There is a subtext to what goes on between the great power rivalries in the world that does involve these particular threats. Are they a threat to everyone? Well, in Australia, no. We're very safe here. So when I'm talking about my expertise, we are looking off into the rest of the world. In the Middle East, there is significant risk. There are people who are intent on developing these kind of threats or hazards so that they can use them to influence other nations or other individuals. So it doesn't necessarily mean you've got to use them. It's having them is enough, and showing that you've got them is also enough. So these are strategic weapons. These are like nuclear weapons in their utilisation. Having them is enough to produce an effect or an outcome that you might want.
So, I mean, by the way, I should say this. David has been, I guess, he really can't. I don't expect him to either get too involved in what interaction he's had with the government during this whole COVID period, and or with the army, and or with anybody. So we're not going to talk about that. But I can assure you that he has been consulted on various occasions for various reasons. But what I would ask you this, and there's conspiracy floating around everywhere, weaponisation of a virus. I mean, is that a real thing? Is that a potential real thing?
Well, we have to consider it. So it comes down. I look at it a different way. Can we discount it? And we can't discount it. So there are a variety of technologies which we call dual-use technologies, which can be used for both good and bad. And so the emergence of DNA sequencing, for example, and then more recently the ability to synthesize all the way through to completely synthesize on the desktop novel or new pathogens from just code, from computer code, the DNA code. That you might
of
have
the pathogen,
and re-life diseases that have been extinct is possible now. It's been shown in the past decade that that's possible. People have demonstrated that as a proof of concept in the literature. You can find those articles, and it just shows that the capabilities that people have at their fingertips now are so much more than they were. So the idea of a synthetic virus, for example, or a engineered virus was science fiction 50 years ago. It's now reality. People can do that. It's possible, and if you have someone or a country that has the intent to do that, they could actually achieve that very easily.
So it's achievable, as
Absolutely.
opposed to intent. Intent is the issue. I mean,
Correct.
So I mean, like, just so I can put that into non professorship talk, if you don't mind. When you say is synthesizing and or re-engineering, I mean, I think maybe what you're saying is maybe let's say I had the technical ability to do this on my laptop. I could get the DNA sequencing of, for example, of the old smallpox or even something worse, the Black Plague or something, and I could re-engineer that on my desktop and produce a new Black Plague. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and that's been demonstrated.
It's been demonstrated. Where?
So there are a number of research groups around the world that have been publishing in this area. They're not and they're not in countries that we have particular concerns about. These are academic groups who felt that it was actually a scientific step that needed to be done, and they published it to great controversy over the past few years. It's funny you mentioned smallpox. It was actually smallpox that they were able to recreate, and smallpox was eradicated from the global human community in 1980. So we had
through vaccination.
Through vaccination and also very deliberate and very expensive, I have to say, public health measures that involved a lot of effort and time through international coordination. And now we stand at a point where an individual with nefarious intent in a laboratory could actually undo all of that in very short order.
So, I mean, it's not because, I mean, look, we'll never know the truth to all these things. I mean, you might have a better idea than I will. We, the general public, will never know. But, you know, the whole Trump theory by Trump saying the China virus, the Wuhan virus, and there are a number of politicians here who are saying it. There's a number of right-wing politicians here who are saying it. Weaponization requires intent. But I think what you're saying is, I can't say that they haven't weaponized it, but it's 100% possible that they could do it if they had the right intent.
Yes, that's true.
Right.
So I think what you're the question that you're leading towards is what we're seeing with COVID, the result of some kind of deliberate action. And I think I have my personal opinion on this.
Do you mind sharing that?
I'm happy to share that, Mark. I think that it would be helpful to frame likelihoods of different possibilities. So
there's more probability based from your point of view, is it?
Well, I think it's useful to think about the issue of intent. What would be the benefit to whoever did it? And the benefit of that for example, China, for example, I don't think that's very clear. That there is any benefit for that, and I would be extraordinarily surprised if they saw any advantage whatsoever in doing that. And in my mind, I have discounted that for the time being.
As opposed to being purposeful,
correct.
You've taken the view that okay, righto, fair enough.
Yeah, and it's simply because they have taken an enormous cost from what has happened with COVID. It certainly wouldn't be in their interest to have done this. In fact, any nation state, it really is not in their interest to do it. Has there been an accident in a laboratory, for example, which is a theory which is out in the media and it's been discussed? I can't discount that.
How would an accident like that happen, though? I mean, for example, I heard or read or I don't know that in Wuhan there is a virology lab or something. Do you know about this?
I do.
Okay, can you explain that?
Yeah. So just like China has developed a very deep and capable biotechnology industry, and over the past few decades, and part of that is some very large research institutes, and it just so happened that Wuhan has a virology institute that happens to be investigating coronaviruses as a research area. Is there the possibility that a pathogen has been released? Yes, that we know that even in the most secure laboratories, accidents do occur. So again, it comes down to can it be discounted? No. If it did occur as an accident, how did that occur is something which is, of course, paramount importance to understand. And we don't have, well, I have not seen any available information about there being an accident or any kind of release of concern. What is far more likely is that there's been coronaviruses are found in certain types of animals. Coronaviruses are found in the general community, and it's far more likely that it's come through an event called crossover, which has occurred at the market.
The wet markets, so-called wet markets.
Correct.
Maybe explain what the wet markets are, because it's not just, it's live animals, is it?
Well, yes, and those live animals are sold for consumption, and they are either butchered at the live market or they are sold and then they're butchered at home. Now, those live markets have a wide variety of different animals that are available, often on sale. I have to note that in China it's been prohibited to sell certain types of animals prior to this year anyway, since in fact 2003 when there was SARS, the first SARS outbreak. However, we're aware that hasn't been so strictly enforced at all wet markets. So there is what happens in the market is that is that a purchaser can select an animal and have it butchered there for them for consumption, and there is the potential then for a wild animal who has an endemic disease like coronavirus in it, like a bat, for example, or we're concerned that it might be a pangolin, which is another animal. When it's butchered, it would transfer to the human who maybe has butchered it, or to the person who's purchased it. But also the blood and other contaminants associated with that butchering could also contaminate the surfaces with virus in that area. And so other activities such as, handling uninfected meat or uninfected animals, by contact would then become in.
How does it cross over though? Does it mutate before it crosses over? Why didn't I just catch it? Why wouldn't someone catch it just by handling the pangolin, for example, as opposed to you're getting the blood or tissue on your hands?
Yeah, you can. So you can, and so that as well, you could have it by direct contact. Generally speaking, there is though. Either a crossover event occurs where the pathogen just simply crosses into the human population because it's able to infect humans already, or that there's some kind of reassortment. So the avian influenza is a good example where there is...
Bird flu?
Yeah, bird flu, where there is actually a genetic event that occurs, creating a new strain.
Right.
And that the likelihood of that genetic event increases the more contact that you have between, for example, in markets often, between pigs and, for example, and
chickens
and ducks or chickens or whatever bird. And that interaction just by frequency means that you've got more and more opportunities for that genetic event to occur. So there's two options. One, you have a direct crossover because you can infect a human being directly, or you have a crossover event that occurs in between two animals that are stored next to each other in the market, producing a new virus that can directly infect humans straight away. Or you've got two animals that are normally quite benign, but they both have influenza, and that crossover event occurs just because they're in the same market area.
What do you reckon it is? I mean, if you're just sitting there at night and watching telly, and you think to yourself, not based on necessarily data, but because you're not going to get access to whatever's going on in China, they're going to tell you. But what do you think?
Yeah, look, I have to say the most likely event is that there's been a crossover event, which has been a genetic event between two animals potentially, but could well be one animal. We don't know for sure one or the other, but we do know it's likely a bat rather than a pangolin. Okay, and then that a human being has come into contact with that animal now in the wet market. That it is by far the most likely. There are other options.
Thank you. Because there's a lot of hysteria running around where it's come from, and the PM's called for an investigation, which may or may not happen. We'll see how that all goes and see where the WHO is, etc. But let's say that your theory is correct. How do you explain mathematically that, I don't know, how many people in the world have had it? How many infections have we had in the world today so far?
Well, officially, we've had just over 10 million cases identified.
One person is in a market somewhere and this virus crosses over. Now we've got 10 million people, I don't know, 6 months later maybe. How does it multiply? How does that work?
Well, it always starts with one. An index case, so it's no surprise that it would be a single event, and the nature of these viruses is they transmit. So initially, when COVID emerged, we have a measure of infectiveness which we call R0, which is, all things being equal, each infection in an individual will go on to cause another certain amount of infections in other people. And so for COVID, that was initially between 2 and 5. We weren't sure, but now it's settled down, we think, to around about 2.5 people.
So just so I know, everyone knows what that means. That means if one person gets it, he or she will transfer it to 2.5 people.
On average.
On average, we're talking averages. Then those 2.5 people will again each transfer it to another 2.5 people.
That's right.
And mathematically, you can arrive at 10 million. Over a period of 6 months, for argument's sake.
Yes. Well, there are two things. The one thing that R0 doesn't tell you is how quickly that transmission will occur. So if
speed is important.
speed is important. So if I'm going to pass it on to 2.5 people over 2 years, then clearly it's going to take a very long time to get to a big number.
Yep.
But for COVID, generally you become infectious at around about 3 to 7 days after you become infected. So you have a short incubation period, and at some point you become symptomatic, which is when you have your symptoms for most people. Now, there is in COVID uniquely has a period of time prior to becoming sick where you're
Becoming
not
infected or sick?
sick.
You're like symptomatic.
Symptomatic, yeah. So there is a short period of time, maybe 1 or 2 days before you get sick, which is unique to COVID, where you're transmitting quite highly, but you have no symptoms.
Because you don't even know you got it.
Correct, but that's very unlike other diseases that we worry about, like influenza, pandemic influenza.
So what's the difference? Because we have had a lot of people say, David, that, it's just another flu. I mean, I remember, or just like a cold. I remember Trump saying, in fact, I said a few times, it's just another flu. Right at the beginning, there is a difference, though, isn't there?
There's a big difference. There's a difference on a whole lot of dimensions, in fact. And I just mentioned that a number of senior researchers around the world have highlighted just how well adapted COVID is to causing a big pandemic. It's even better than influenza at doing it.
Or worse.
And I'll touch, better from a capability perspective.
Yeah.
So I'll touch on those because I think they are very
No,
important.
please do, yeah.
So firstly, you have what we call pre-symptomatic transmission. What that means is that prior to becoming symptomatic, you are transmitting COVID to other people. So it's very difficult to then try to stop people interacting when they don't even know they're sick. We've always had the advantage in the past of knowing when to have people go home and isolate, and that is generally exactly when people become infectious. So as long as you're very quick at isolating people after they become sick, then you're going to control the pandemic or the epidemic well. For COVID, we don't have that luxury. We have 1 or 2 days where spread can occur and we're not even aware of it. The second part of COVID is it doesn't transmit only through the respiratory route, which is by air. It also transmits through touch. So it persists quite well on surfaces like plastic, steel, wood, which all of which have been tested in laboratories with COVID. And for example, smooth plastic and steel can have active COVID on it for up to 3 days. And so that's why this message of hygiene and cleaning high touch, high contact surfaces is so important.
Well, how's that relative to, say, flu, for example? I mean, in a relative sense.
So flu actually doesn't survive well on surfaces. Coronavirus is quite persistent, much more persistent on surfaces than influenza or other viruses, and that's quite unique.
And is that something it's sort of uniquely evolved into? I mean, is that an evolved thing? I mean, why is this thing so smart? Why is this virus so clever? I mean, viruses are living things. I mean, explain a little bit about them.
Yeah, so viruses are not technically living. They actually require a living cell to work.
Right.
So bacteria, which we're familiar with, like if you have a tonsillitis with a bacterial infection, the bacteria themselves can live on their own, and they just grow on whatever fuel or food they can get a hold of. Viruses can't do that. Viruses need living cells to infect. So what you have in a virus is a packaged up message that when it transfers to you, it infects a cell, and then it opens up and does its business inside the cell. It replicates and reproduces, and then it repackages itself to transmit to other people, other environments, or to persist on surfaces. So viruses are very different to bacteria. They're not living in their own right. They require another living thing to actually allow them to transmit and to reproduce and to evolve.
Right, they're very clever by the sound of things. Like it's very sophisticated.
It is very sophisticated. So, as I mentioned to you before, the the issue of persistence or the hardiness of coronavirus in the environment is unique to the respiratory pathogens. Well, it's not entirely true. Smallpox, for example, we know can persist on garments, for example, or in scabs for a very, very long time, months, years even. And that's why smallpox was always so dangerous, is that it could be transmitted a long time after the person has recovered. Because of its persistence, but at this point, coronavirus is unique in the world because smallpox is not around, in that it is persistent. So when we talk about mass gatherings, when we talk about public transport, when we talk about offices and people working together in areas where there is COVID, you're not just thinking about social distancing. You're actually thinking about the potential from a safety perspective of having COVID actually contaminating surfaces. So the things that I've been asked to think about quite seriously are, shared computers, open office spaces.
I know you haven't got your hands on this desk. Is that the reason why? Is that why you keep your hands on your lap?
It's funny. I think everyone's behaviour has changed, and mine certainly has.
No, I'm just thinking I've got my hands on here. I had someone else in here really. Well, because this is called Straight Talk, and I guess what I want to say to everybody here is that I need to get some science around what I'm getting told by politicians, because I'll be honest with you, like politicians, they're just there to speak on behalf of all the advice they got, and who knows whether they're interpreting the advice properly. So I think what you're saying here, David, is if we are to try and put some common sense to antibacterial, which by says bacteria, doesn't say antivirus, but these sort of hand sanitizers.
It's antiviral.
Yeah, antiviral, okay. So this hand sanitizer, the reason why we're getting told at restaurants to clean the surface down, what we told the gym, when you leave the machine, you have to clean it down. We have to apply the stuff to yourself every time you touch a door or a lift button or a computer screen, etc. It's not all bullshit stuff, which we tend to think, oh, that sounds like bullshit to me. Yeah. It's real because of the persistence of the ability for the coronavirus or COVID-19 to remain active, or whatever the words are, on surfaces.
Absolutely.
As opposed to other things.
Correct.
Which is a new thing for us.
It is. Normally we don't think of that. We cover our nose with our elbow. If we're sick, we stay at home. And the dogma, and it's the right word, the dogma in healthcare, the dogma in industrial hygiene, when we're talking about risk of transmission in a workplace, has been focused more around masks, respiratory protection, and stopping transfer by droplets across. For example, if I'm talking, there would be a screen, for example, that would protect you. But we don't think a lot about contaminated surfaces and who was in the room 2 hours ago, and is that important? These are all things which are completely new, and it's been a huge challenge for many organisations to think that through, and including the Army that I work with, and also in healthcare.
Well, that's an interesting, because protocols, and I don't want to get too technical, but protocols become really important. We have a protocol in our organisation here in this building, in fact. Whereas where it is that I know, well, there's a register of exactly who comes in, what time, how long they're here for, largely for tracing reasons. So if someone does get sick here in the building, we can actually trace back or give that to the health authorities to do their own tracing. But it is about, from my point of view, everyone thinks I'm being a narc by imposing these protocols. But nothing gets approved here unless I sign off. And we've got a couple hundred people here that I sign off on behalf of. But I just want to be able to say, here's a spreadsheet. I know how long David was in here, what day was in here, where he sat, who he sat with. So I know that you sat in this vicinity here and you touched this surface and maybe that door handle on the way out. And I know also that there was hand sanitizer here, because it is an insurance issue too. It is a liability issue
Absolutely.
for me as well.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So that's the surface one. And you did talk about it can be spread through the air, or whatever the words are. How did we work out 1.5 meters or 2 meters? It was 2.5 meters. Now we're down to 1 meter. I mean, how did we work out how that shit works? I mean, the distance. Or is that just it sounds right? Because I heard some people say it falls at 1.5 meters to the ground or something. I don't know.
Who told you that?
I heard it on, I don't know, it was on Sky or something. I don't know.
Okay, well...
Explain that part.
For the audience, and because I have a very pragmatic approach to things, and this has been the subject of active research and, I have to say, controversy in the academic world. Well,
that's unusual.
No, yes, it's incredibly unusual. But this one's been a hot potato, I have to say.
Masks?
No, the issue of 1.5 metres
Right.
and the issue of droplets. So I'm very fortunate to work with some experts, global experts on this area, and we have often discussed and in fact investigated and researched the issue of just how far can droplets go. Now, many of you in the audience will be quite aware that if you have a big sneeze, there is no way that a droplet's going to drop out at 1.5 metres. And in fact that's exactly true. The research bears that out. That someone who has a large expulsion or a big sneeze or a cough
At a certain speed, because it comes out at like 120 k's an hour or something ridiculous.
Comes out much faster than
much
that.
faster. So speed by weight is going to go a certain distance.
Yeah. So there are certain sizes of droplets that come out. In fact, there's a range of droplets that come out of your respiratory tract or your mouth and your nose when you sneeze or cough. Now, some of those are big enough to be launched with momentum for far longer than 1.5 metres. Most will fall out within a certain range. Some will be so fine that they become aerosolized and will waft around an area for a period of time. So the issue of 1.5 metres actually comes from historical research done all the way back around the 1950s, where and it was good research for the time, where they were looking for what is a safe distance for most respiratory pathogens of concern to various types of workers, like healthcare workers, for example. And the idea was, how do we design our facilities? How do we design our workplaces so that they're safe? The problem is it assumes that all pathogens are equal. It also assumes that everyone who's sneezing is equal. It also assumes that environmental conditions are equal, which they're not.
It's not windy, for example.
It's not windy. It's not humid or dry.
Yeah.
It's not hot or cold. It's just controlled testing. And so we find ourselves in actually a highly variable world, which is, for all practical purposes, either able to support droplets going a long way or not. And there's been some very interesting recent work. I think a Swedish study was done a number of months ago, looking at the simulated spread of small droplets within supermarkets, for example, or in controlled synthetic rooms, so computer simulation. And small droplets were simulated to be wafting around for hours and hours. And in fact, COVID-19 has been shown to be possibly able to remain persistent within the air for quite some time in certain conditions. And it doesn't fall out within 1.5 metres, and it certainly doesn't disappear in a short period of time.
So is the 1.5 metres, 2 metres, the 4 square metre rules in offices and restaurants was now been reduced to 2 square metres. Is that just a value judgment that sort of trying to be practical, but at the same time trying to be cautious? I mean,
yeah, that's exactly what it is.
It is.
Just to highlight, the 1.5 metre rule is an agreement between most healthcare organisations that is the distance at which droplet precautions, when you're dealing with someone who could be infectious, that we're comfortable with that. However, it doesn't mean that beyond 1.5 metres, for example, at 151 centimetres, you're safe.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that. It just means that all things being equal, we've decided that that's the safe distance that we're going to operate with.
So it's a value judgment, basically.
Absolutely.
Someone's made a judgment, and
Yes.
and they've issued that judgment to us. Well, I want to move on quickly onto masks, because masks have been politicised.
Yes.
I mean, especially in America, we don't really get, it hasn't not happening here, but we see Joe Biden every time he turns up, he's got a black mask. It's not just a mask; he's got he's got the mask of death on him, sort of thing. And then you got Fauci, who has the mask and he takes it off. He doesn't. Then you got Trump says, "I'm not wearing a fucking mask." Okay, so it's highly politicised. And at the beginning of this, I remember hearing this clearly, and I think I heard Norman Swan say it, is that masks protect the person. They don't protect you from not getting it, they protect you from transferring it. So this is right at the beginning of the COVID discussion, like March or something, beginning. do masks work, and what type of masks work?
Yeah. So the masks that Norman was talking about are the surgical masks or the day-to-day masks that we can get access to normally through the chemist here in Australia. And so that's correct. So it's about shielding you, launching your secretions onto others effectively. We all know that there's gaps around the edges of them all. Do they protect you from
Receiving it?
Receiving it, yes, they do, but not a lot.
Right.
So there's also quite extensive research on what respiratory protection works. So surgical masks are definitely protective. They're very good at stopping you from projecting droplets or secretions onto others. They provide an element of filtration when it passes through the mask, but we know that there's ways to get around the edges of the mask.
So, well, what is this being politicised? Like when Joe Biden, who would be protected, like he'll have like an entourage of people making sure that there's no one near him, and he won't be going into dangerous environments. Allegedly, I'm sure people go and wipe down everything before he sits down because he's potentially going to be the president of the United States. He's not a young man either. Is he wearing this? Do you think he's wearing this to make a point?
Well, I do, and as a leader, I'm strongly encouraging of education and messaging that comes with being a strong leader. And if that means that you wear a mask when perhaps it's not entirely necessary, but it encourages people to do that, then I'm fully supportive of that from a public health perspective. But if he was, for example, in a situation where he was going to be at risk actually of being exposed because we knew it was a risky situation, not just as a casual potential contact, my recommendation to him would be to wear a higher grade of protection. So we're familiar with the N95 mask, for example.
I know that's a different type of mask, isn't it?
It's a different type of mask, but it's fitted.
Yes.
And doesn't have so many of the issues of ingress of air around the edges, for example, and the filtration is guaranteed to a certain efficiency. And so when we talk about masks and politicisation, I think we're talking about surgical masks and whether people wear them day to day casually, whether that's effective. And it is. There's been a lot of controversy about that. But beyond that, in high-risk situations where you need either an N95 or even more protection than that.
The one with the plastic shield.
Or if
is what the doctors use in surgery, etc.
Yep. Or if you're working in ICU and you need to have even more protection than that. When you're doing very, very risky procedures, then there's no question that masks, and we'll call them respiratory protection, of a higher grade are absolutely life-saving. So much so that there are certain procedures that ICU physicians do, like intubation or providing medications in certain ways, where you have to wear that level of protection. Otherwise, you're from a risk perspective, you're putting that person at huge risk.
Okay, so all right, so we've got masks, may or may not work, are effective, but the question is how effective they are. We've got distancing. It's a valid judgment. Someone's made a practical judgment as to what works under circumstances, and they're slowly but surely reducing those distances. We're talking about surfaces and proper hygiene and management. Washing hands. I mean, as I understand it, the virus doesn't really like it when you wash your hands. Soap gets rid of it. Caustic soda gets rid of it.
Oh, well, the detergent actually breaks up the virus.
Yeah, breaks it up. Yep. So it must like living in fats or something. Does it have some sort of lipid relationship?
It does. So cells themselves that it lives in actually are composed of fats.
Right.
So yes, if you can create a very unfriendly environment, which detergents do, then the virus will be inactivated.
So it's probably not a good idea to put hand cream on every morning and go and touch things.
Hand cream's okay. Don't
mind. But now I want to. What most people here don't know is David was very heavily involved in assisting the NRL in its protocols and getting them approved by the various people. Have to approve these things so that the NRL could get back online and start playing footy again. When you build these protocols, and I have to say, Dave was also extremely helpful in helping a good friend of mine and a great Australian. He's left today. He's off to Fight Island. He's Alex Volkanovski, currently the UFC featherweight champion of the world. He's gone to defend his position, and if it hadn't been for David, Alex would not have been able to accept the contract with Dana White, UFC, and he would not have been able to train, and he probably would have had to relinquish his position as featherweight champion of the world. But as a result of David's like literally 1 or 2 day turnaround, we got it approved. I want to know, David, in terms of protocols, do you say to the players, listen, you guys are going to start training, you're going to wear masks?
So it's really important to understand that the NRL and my involvement in the NRL is as a risk advisor, and the message from the government, and particularly I have to say the New South Wales government has been quite helpful on this, is that their first messaging to the NRL was, we're happy for you to play and to restart your competition as long as you meet what are known as the WHS requirements. Now, WHS requirements and COVID are a...
What's WHS?
So work health and safety.
Right.
From a legal point of view, but also from a practical point of view. And so when you say, do I say to the players, can you wear a mask? Well, we do. In fact, we consult as part of our WHS requirements. We're consulting constantly with the Coaches Association, the Rugby League Players Association, directly with players, directly with the media now that matches have started and operations. So it's a deep and meaningful consultation where we actually float options to them. There are certain hard edges. This has to be done because the risk is too high. That's my recommendation, and there are a number of other specialists who I work with who provide that risk input. But overall, it's not simply just saying, you will do this. We do ask and consult, and it has to be a negotiation.
So do you have these are the non-negotiables? These are your gold class risk management processes? Absolutely. I don't know what they are. Quarantine all the players. They can't go out other than for an essential service or go to a doctor or buy their food. They can't go and play golf. They can't go to the pub and have a beer. It's like, they're your gold plated. Then here's your silver ones and here's your bronze ones. They're optional. Well, we'd like you to take all of them, but some aren't going to be practical. Is that what you do?
Yeah, that's right. So initially we had very strict protocols, and remember, we also had to get approval. So the protocols that went up initially were really, that was the first toe in the water, and the government was quite cautious. So we thought that we'd controlled our risks, which I think we did very well. And then we had to ask and say, government, are you happy with this as well? And they said, yes, we are.
Who in government? Who do you talk to?
So we've got really good relationships with all of the chief health officers of the health departments. But that's our entree into what is actually really a discussion between Premier and the Chief Health Officer, right, and us in the end. So they analyse our protocols themselves. They ask.
When you say they, you mean their department, or yes. I mean the Chief Health Officer in New South Wales is
Kerry Chant.
Kerry Chant, right? Dr. Kerry Chant. Do you talk to her, or do you talk to her team? Is she the one making all the calls, or is it a big team?
It's a big team, and things have changed. So when Peter V'landers first decided that he wanted to move forward with the season opening at the end of May, the discussions were at a very high level, but also many of the staff in New South Wales Health were busy dealing with the peak that was occurring around April and early May. And so we were by necessity dealing with senior leadership the whole way through. And we continue to do that. And there have been bumps along the way where we've had to intervene. There've been scares, there's been potential interactions at schools. We've had to get rapid testing done. We've had to talk about border closures, and all of these things have, sometimes require a half-hour turnaround on some decisions to get done. But generally speaking, we deal with the highest levels because it's more efficient. They've got a huge staff that provides them with detailed input onto the particularly protocol reviews. And so, as I said before, we started with this really, high stringency and sort of low risk threshold protocols, and we've evolved those with a number of reviews as cases have become less prevalent in Australia.
Or in New South Wales.
In New South Wales and Queensland. And to be able to allow our players to do more. Because the impact on the players is huge. It's not out there much, but the players are suffering. They are subject to far more restrictions than the general population.
I have met up with a couple that just walking into a shop and I saw a vegetable place. I met up with a particular, and he was saying like it's giving him sort of not mental problems, but it's driving him mad.
Yeah.
He's just stuck. Can I, because we're going to run out of time, and I could go on for hours on this, but I can't let you go without just giving me or trying to make some sense of what's going on in Victoria at the moment.
Sure.
I mean, Victoria was, as I understand, one of the strictest. I mean, it looked like to me one of the strictest in terms of what the Andrews government was doing down there. They were, they were onto everybody in big time, and now all of a sudden it's broken out there big time. So, I mean, is this a matter of a whole lot of security? Is this a matter of one or two or some security guards sort of getting up to mischief in relation to hotels where people have returned from overseas with it and just spread it, like that one theory you come up with before with a reproduction rate of 2.5 and it's just escalated quickly?
It doesn't take much for it to get out. So we have to be. I think we have to be generous to people when they're working. That things are never perfect. If somebody's done something wrong and there's an inquiry going on, if somebody's done something wrong, or if there's been
silly,
or silly, sure, that will be dealt with. But I have to say, I'm not. I don't feel any ill will towards Victoria or how they've managed things. It's just a very bad situation that it could have happened anywhere else in the country.
Is it bad?
Yeah, it is. Coronavirus is not flu.
No, but the numbers now, 75 or whatever it was I heard yesterday.
It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Right, okay, so it's not peaking. So have you done any modelling around peaking for Victoria?
Well, we have a very recent similar example in Victoria of how things unfolded. We've had the Ruby Princess event, which was a large outbreak very quickly in New South Wales predominantly, which we can also look to for examples of how this might unfold. The problem with Australia is, in the sense of modelling, is that we have such an agile and well-resourced public health system that we can't really predict how this will unfold. I have my fingers crossed that we'll have, yes, a little bit more worsening, but within the next 2 weeks, I would say we'll start to see flattening and then drop off in Victoria, because they're taking this extremely seriously. Like, they really are doing everything that they can possibly do to get this under control. So I have no doubt that this will start to see a curve back down towards no cases.
Is this going to move to New South Wales? I mean, because the borders are they're all they're synthetic. It's bullshit. There's no such thing as a border. There's no wall.
No. It's entirely possible. So I would be unsurprised to see a small increase in cases in New South Wales, but we may be pleasantly surprised. People may completely follow all of the instructions, and we may not see cases. Irrespective of whether we people do follow the rules, COVID has this unfortunate aspect that a number or a percentage of the people who get it have no symptoms ever, called asymptomatic, and so those people could unwittingly spread it around Victoria or into New South Wales.
Why is that? I mean, let's say I'm asymptomatic, which means I don't have any symptoms, but I still got it. How come I don't end up in intensive care and say that bloke around the corner might? How does that work?
We don't know. There was a very interesting family in New York and New Jersey, I should say, that a lot of them had passed away from COVID, and it wasn't those in the family who actually had medical problems or who were potentially very old. There was young people who were otherwise well. We don't know. It could be genetic. It could just be the amount of infection you initially got when you got infected.
Are there different strains of it? Is it stronger in some other place like Spain or Italy, where it really wiped a lot of people out?
No, there are some minor variations in the genetics, but there's no major differences in strains. So we're not seeing sort of a super COVID and a mild COVID at this point.
Right. Okay. So where do you think Victoria? So you're saying 2 weeks. I mean, I know you guys do your modelling and you model out because it's quite important. Do you think that off the back of what's going on, like school holidays at the moment in Victoria and New South Wales and maybe just Queensland, I'm not sure, but certainly New South Wales and Victoria, do you think that school holidays present a bigger risk and therefore you'd rather wait until the school holidays are over before you're going to make further predictions?
No, I think the school holidays actually are going to present lower risk.
Lower risk, right?
I do. So the risk of school holidays is that the kids get out and do stuff and mix together. But actually, if that's controlled, then the school holidays is lower risk because kids are at home in their household and they're not going to school.
Right.
So that is a huge advantage. So there's the government in Victoria have the opportunity actually to manipulate the school holidays as a control mechanism, which as a public health person, expert, I would recommend they consider that. It gives them the opportunity to keep the kids at home for longer than the school holidays if needed, and that is a very effective control. Initially, we thought that school kids couldn't really transmit it between each other effectively. That's turning out to be quite not exactly the case.
We did get told that for a period of time. Yeah.
We did. I don't think that's supportable as scientifically anymore. I think we've got enough evidence that children do transmit. They may transmit it slightly less efficiently, but we're talking a slightly, not almost none. They definitely do transmit between each other, and schools are a great environment for that to occur. So having schools off is a very good thing.
So COVID has maybe, this is a dangerous thing, but statistically, and I presume this is a global statistic, but 1 or less than 1% mortality rate. Would it be about right?
Yep.
Right. So in other words, for every 100 people who get it, one person will die.
Yes.
What is it that you die from? I mean, it's not the virus, is it? What do you die from?
Right. Well, that is actually quite a complex question that you've asked. So you can die directly from the virus.
But how? I mean, what happens to you?
So it can be what we call sort of an overwhelming infection of the virus. It causes all your organs to shut down from the virus. Okay. Now that's actually a very small amount of people.
That's even less than 1%, I'd say.
Yeah. That's a very, very small amount of people. So when we say directly from the virus, it depends what you mean. So directly from the virus, if you mean that it's the people who get the pneumonia from the virus and otherwise they would not have had they don't have any other medical problem, and there's no other medical problem that actually flows on from that for them, like they have a heart attack or other things, which I'll come to, then yes, it's between 0.5 and 1%.
Right.
Okay. The problem is that there's a group of people who are very severely unwell with COVID, who, unless they get medical treatment, maybe about 5% of people, unless they actually get medical treatment like oxygen, like intubation, an ICU bed, various treatments like various drugs, and just general supportive care in a hospital, then they're quite high risk of dying as well. So
from the other things that they have.
That's right. So it depends on what you mean by directly from the virus. So it can be due to the virus but as a consequence of something else, or it can be directly. So the direct virus mortality we think is about 0.5 to 1%. But in some places where they do not have resources, mortality can be quite higher.
Which is why we talk about Indigenous communities, because I've been trying to work out why it seems to me that the mortality rate in the US is much higher than the mortality rate here in Australia, just as a percentage. And it may be because, generally speaking, a number of the people who've got it in the US are just more unhealthy for whatever the reasons are.
That could be an explanation, and I think that does account for some of it. The other issue is testing. So imagine that you're not testing very many people in your community for COVID, or you're restricting access to the test. So in Australia, we've got lots of testing. So the more tests you do, the more
you're going to find.
The more cases that are mild you're going to find. Therefore, your effective mortality rate is lower.
In other words, your denominator increases and your numerator stays, the number of deaths stays the same.
Right. So in the US, the CDC has estimated that they're underestimating true case counts by up to 10 times.
Yeah, I heard that.
So if they've got a mortality rate of maybe 10%, which they've actually seen in some places, then actually that's 1%.
Yeah, if the right number of people tested. Yeah. So, and because what Trump said, I heard him say that. Well, if we did less testing, we'd have different numbers. I mean, he didn't actually express it very well. Because it looked like he was saying let's not test. But I think his point was the point you just made.
Yes.
The percentage of people who die relative to the number of people that get it looks very, very high in the US at the moment.
It does look very high. And unfortunately for the United States, they've got a lot of cases, and they've got a lot of undetected cases. And I've got colleagues and friends from the United States, and they're desperately unhappy about what's unfolding. It's very traumatic, and very difficult for them. So, look, the facts of the matter is they've got a large population. There's only so much testing you can do, and it may be at the end of the pandemic. Before we actually know the true extent of not only the deaths, but the true extent of the cases that went through the population. But unless they get a handle on it, their population could end up having over 50% ultimately getting COVID, which is a huge number of people.
Wow, that's 100 million people.
It's 150.
150 million people, yeah. That's ridiculous.
It's a lot. And the same goes for a number of other big countries around the world, Brazil, Russia. These countries had good health systems, and they just unless you're proactive. And probably the biggest thing I wanted to say about Victoria, which I didn't come back to, but it is important, is, and I think this is where Australia got it right, is this concept of the first movers. So Australia has been put in a club called the First Movers Club, and I agree with that. There was a very strong push in March to do more. And rather than wait and see and do a little bit, take small steps and just react, there was very much a push to take more than a few steps, to overreact a bit, to get ahead of the virus.
That's not where the government was initially, though.
It's not. They were pushed there, but they were pushed there with all of best intention, and it worked well. And I think the message that I've got for Victoria, and I think we're seeing this as well, is that if you apparently overreact, then
it looks like an overreaction,
then you're well ahead. And the issue comes down to actually the delay between infection and when you know that you've got a case.
That's 2 days.
It's more than that, actually. So the some people can be incubating for up to 14 days. That's why we quarantine for 14 days.
Right.
So anything that you do in terms of intervention takes 14 days to have an effect. But any testing you're doing actually reflects a point in time of cases maybe a week to 14 days ago. And so if you're making decisions on the current figures today, you're actually not making decisions based on what you predict is happening today. You're making them on what was going on a week ago.
Which is why mathematics is really important here.
Absolutely, it is.
And modelling.
Absolutely. So unfortunately for our allies and partners around the world, they perhaps didn't act quickly enough. They were perhaps more reactive than proactive, and once you have a certain amount of cases in your country, it's very hard to catch up.
Because there was that big debate, Sweden did it, but there was the big debate, even Boris Johnson was saying about the herd mentality, but the herd immunity, I should say. Let's build herd immunity. But he dropped off that pretty quickly, Boris, especially when he got it. But that debate, I presume that debate was had here, but our government were either prompted or nudged to make that early intervention call, and I'm talking about the federal level and all the states, which actually worked out well for us. I'm going to ask you one more final question. And for a healthcare professional, a scientist, maybe it's an unfair question to you, but I'm a hard-edged economist. Okay, I'm interested in economies and numbers, GDP, unemployment, recessions, blah blah blah. Or no recession. Where's the balancing act, and or what comes first, or do they both operate in tandem between making sure our numbers aren't out of control like they are in the US, and at the same time trying to balance that up against making sure the economy does get completely rolled over and pushed down the hill, which is, by the way, probably where the US is going to end up anyway. Is that a discussion that gets had with people like yourself?
Yeah, it is. It is. So very early on, there was a discussion about this in academic circles and very early on in government circles. Is it better to have the pandemic in terms of the mortality than have a huge recession, lock down the world, and have what is now being called an epidemic of starvation in certain parts of the world,
100%,
or
depression, suicide, everything else.
Exactly.
We are currently running at more suicides this year through the pandemic than we've ever had in the past. And our number of suicides is far greater than the 100 and odd people who passed away from COVID so far.
In Australia, that's...
In Australia.
Yes. This is a difficult thing because you're dealing with a... what would happen if we had let this thing unfold in Australia without controlling it as we did. And it's difficult to know exactly how many deaths we have avoided in Australia, but some estimates from the Chief Health Officer were approximately 15 to 20,000. COVID-related deaths have been avoided with the actions taken so far. And that was assuming a certain worst-case scenario here in Australia. I do think that you need to consider both sides of the equation.
But how is it considered? I mean, could you sort of enlighten us? What is the process? What does the discussion look like? Does the Treasurer walk and say, "No way, I'm not going to do that"? Does the T walk in and say, "Josh, there's no way. I'm not putting us into that debt, and I'm not going to put us into that recession"?
Yeah, it comes down to what you know will happen versus what could happen. And so there is a balance between the two of those things. So is it defensible to allow people to die of something that we know is going to happen because we think that it's going to have a potential impact that, for example, on suicides or other factors later down the track? And this is
it's a moral hazard.
It's a huge moral hazard. It's also a legal problem as well.
More responsibility. Yeah, I get it. Yep.
Yeah. So it depends. It depends on sort of how you view your responsibilities. And I think things in retrospect are easy to compare, but at the time that you're making decisions, the forefront decision is saving lives from something that you know is going to cause mortality now, compared to something which is potentially going to cause a problem later down the track, maybe 6 to 12 months, that may or may not occur reliably, although we're pretty sure that it's going to have a big negative impact. And so I think what's happened is that there's been a clear, we want to save lives now, and we'll do everything we can to avoid the impacts later. I think that was the decision making because behind the scenes, although I wasn't privy to that level of decision making, that's certainly what appears to have occurred. The other thing is if you let the virus, this particular virus, run rampant, then the economic consequences of the health impact
could be worse,
are going to be far, far worse than the impact economically from controlling now.
Which looks like is going to happen in the US.
Absolutely.
If you get like 20% of the population, not 50%, 20% of the population who've got it, the US will be in terrible economic problem.
And there are many uncertainties. For example, the COVID survivors, for example, we have a lot of concern about the long-term ramifications for their physical health. There's going to be a lot more healthcare expenditure on these individuals. They have higher risk of cardiac injury, they have higher risk of other health effects, mental illness, and people don't recover well after being on a ventilator. People don't recover well after being even having COVID. It causes long-term impacts, and so letting it run in the community is actually there are both tangible and intangible impacts on from an economic perspective, and I think we haven't priced the intangible social impacts of having hundreds of thousands of people die. We haven't really looked at the healthcare impacts of losing most of your senior clinicians in some countries due to COVID.
Particularly in the US at the moment. Not here. We've been lucky here in Australia.
We've been lucky, but in countries where there are high, the risk to healthcare workers working in an ICU, for example, or in, between 10-20% of those clinicians are finding that they're becoming infected.
Which becomes a generational issue. It takes another generation to replace those.
Right. So there are some intangibles that I think probably need to be factored in.
Well, what have you learned from it? What do you think we've learned from it? Because, okay, we've got the COVID, we know what it does, we made some mistakes, we've done some good things, we've got an economic thing we've got to resolve, and how that's going to resolve we don't know. We got all the theorists at the moment, all the economists who are arguing about whether or not they should, ditch the Keynes theory, ditch all the other theories, economic theories that we used to use about spending money and not going into deficit, etc., but just go into deficit, just print money. There's a lot of discussion. What have we learned? Because something else will happen. We'll have another event. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I'm just saying we'll have another event. Okay.
Yeah.
What have we learned?
Yeah, look, this is open debate right now within the academic community, and I've got a certain position, and I also put forward my own views on this. So I'll speak from my perspective.
Yep.
We've learnt that we need to be adaptable. So economics and health are flip sides of the same coin from my view. It all comes down to when I'm talking epidemics. Epidemics are in fact so closely tied to economic activity, because economic activity is human behaviour.
Well-being generally.
That's right. It's people's interactions. So it's if we've got a society where imagine a society where people's interactions could not be adapted in any way to any unforeseen circumstance. And I can see that in some countries with COVID. They just can't change. They just have no capacity to change. People have to go to work because they don't have any savings.
Brazil's a good example.
Yeah, exactly. Then they're so fragile and rigid that they're stuck. Now, what I think we're learning is that you need to think about adaptability, because the consequences of a lack of adaptability and flexibility to these crises, which are increasing in frequency, we're having a scare already about a new swine flu coming through.
I heard about that, yeah.
Right? We've had an increasing number of new emerging pathogens over the past few decades. So there is going to be another pandemic at some point, but it will be much sooner than the last big one, which was the Spanish flu. So
1918 or 1919. Right. So it's 100 years ago.
Well, it's probably going to be in the well before that next 100 years, the next time around. Now, if we run a society economically, whatever, or how we interact is so inflexible, and there's no redundancy there for us to be able to move into what is a safe way of operating in response to that, then it will impact again, and we'll go through another cycle like we've just seen. So for me, the lesson is adaptability as much as preparedness. So we talk about preparedness having, stockpiles of this, but it's more than that. The way that Australia was on every measure, far out in front of every other nation, probably except for New Zealand. But the two, on every measure, government resilience, flexibility, the institutions in the country, how we all pull together as a community, our education, the personal resources that we've got, and the compliance and adherence from the population and goodwill, everything together contributed. It wasn't simply health. It certainly wasn't health. In fact, health was a central part of it, but it was everything together. So Australia has an experience which I think we can communicate, that it's that kind of adaptability that counts. That's I think the lesson.
And that's a big impost, and I'm going to close it off now, but I think that's a big impost on our leaders. I mean, our leaders are probably now going, wow, as a Prime Minister or a Treasurer or a Premier or Chief of Health or whatever it is, my obligations going forward are going to be far more significant and far more complex in the future, because you never know. One of these things might not happen in 100 years or 50 years, it might happen in 2 years. It could be just another version of COVID. It could be COVID-20 or COVID-21. It could change. And I guess when we're electing members of Parliament, and also when members of Parliament are presenting themselves for election, we need to know that we have, and I think we do have, but we need to know we have, as voters and as the community and the constituency, we have the best possible people in that seat. And one of the things that comes out of it for me is I think we need to pay these people more money. We shouldn't be, the Prime Minister probably gets paid well and the Treasury gets paid well, but the rest of them don't get paid particularly well given what their obligations and responsibilities are. And we need to attract the very best people in the country into those roles, and all the various people that sit below them and and sort of surround them, because these are big decisions. Because you just said you're going to have scientists telling you one thing, healthcare professionals telling you one thing, and scientists telling you another thing. You're going to have something else, and then you're going to have the economists telling you, and the Treasury telling you something else. You're going to have the community saying, "Don't shut me down because I can't afford to go broke." Then you can have people talking about their superannuation. There's a 1,000 balls Scott Morrison had to throw up in the air, and he got it this time. But I think there was an element of luck in there too. I'm not taking anything away from his efforts or his thinking.
Well, can I comment?
Yeah, please.
So I think there has been something which has been identified that has been very, very special about how this was managed, and it's to Scott Morrison's credit, but also all the other leaders of the states. So with the federated system, the states have ultimate responsibility for certain decisions that are very much core to pandemic response. So the state health systems, quarantine, it's a state level decision.
Schools, transport, the whole thing. Yep.
So the national cabinet construct helped significantly. Without that, I think we would have been in a far different situation. So the political leadership shown by constructing that decision-making body and having a way of building quick consensus and quick decision-making on relevant issues, I think was probably the standout for me in terms of the decisions that were made. In terms of remuneration, look, I think there's always an argument to remunerate responsibility, risk, and also competence well.
Totally.
So that I would agree in that sense.
It's like our police. The risk-reward formula is just way out of kilter. I mean, they take risk every day, they get rewarded very little. I think now politicians are taking huge risks.
Sure.
And they should be rewarded.
But that being said, when I mentioned the institutions stepped up, I think Australia is blessed with a country that when it comes to we do bicker and we do complain a lot, but I think when the times are and I think it's related. So when the times are good and everyone's bickering, I'm happy because people feel free to be able to do that. But when we actually were really looking at a major issue, everyone pulled together. It was quite something. So it's the patriotism that comes from by action, not by saying.
Yeah.
So we don't flag wave. We just get on and do it, and we pull together bipartisan support. People actually believe that Australia as an institution, as a thing, needs to be protected. And I know a lot of people who did a lot of things behind the scenes to actually get us in the right spot. And I think having a country that enables those people to do that, that we're moderately well remunerated in our jobs, people are generally happy. These things all helped on the day to give people the freedom to actually step up and say, this is what needs to be done, and we'll do it.
I appreciate it. You know what? This is a particularly long discussion, but I think it's worth going right through it, and it has been worth it for me from my point of view. I want to thank David, one, for sharing his intellect. That's a very generous thing for him to do, sharing his time. What he did for the NRL, for me personally, I'm on the board of the Sydney Roosters, but as a fan of NRL, and just as a fan of being able to watch sport during that tough time, that tough period, that isolation period, just from my dad's point of view, my old dad, it's extremely important. So that generosity of his time and his intellect and just putting his shoulder behind stuff was really, really important. I want to thank, I want to thank David too, also for all the behind the scenes stuff he does, which we don't talk about here, which there's no need to talk about. People like David are great Australians, and I've got a lot out of this, and I hope you got a lot out of it too. So thanks very much, David.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Pete.